Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to the first AVERT webinar for 2021. We're delighted to be back in the saddle, delivering what we hope will be a really exciting program for the remainder of the year. My name is Michelle Grossman. I am the convener of the AVERT Research Network. Today's webinar with Associate Professor Shiri Krebs is going to be moderated by Mark Duckworth, who is Senior Research Fellow in the Center for Resilient and Inclusive Societies at Deakin University, and of course an AVERT Research Network member. I'm going to hand over to Mark now, who is going to just go through the couple of ground rules that we have for the webinar, and of course introduce and then moderate Shiri's webinar presentation. So over to you, Mark.
Thank you very much, Michelle. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that we are meeting on the lands, wherever we are, of the First Peoples of Australia, and pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. It's my great pleasure to host this webinar today with Associate Professor Shiri Krebs, who's Associate Professor of Law at Deakin Law School and is also co-lead of the Law and Policy theme of the Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Center and affiliate scholar at the Stanford Center on International Security and Cooperation. Just a few ground rules before we begin. First of all, this webinar is being recorded so that people know that. Secondly, if I could remind everybody to mute yourselves and make sure that you're muted. And the way that this webinar will operate is that Shiri will speak for about half an hour, and then we'll have a discussion. We'll have questions for half an hour. To make this as straightforward as possible, could I ask that as Shiri is speaking, that you put questions into the chat function, and when we reach the end of Shiri's presentation, I will read out the question, and that's the best way that we found in the past to organize these types of events. So with that housekeeping out of the way, I will now pass over to Shiri Krebs. Shiri.
Thank you very much, Mark, for this introduction. And I'm very grateful to Mark, Michelle, and the entire AVERT network team for organizing this and for inviting me to present my research here today. Thank you all for coming, and I look forward to the discussion at the end of my presentation. So my presentation today will focus on some challenges that arise from the extensive use of predictive technologies in various contexts in which preventive counterterrorism decision-making processes are taking place. To begin the presentation, I would like to use an example. So during the presentation, I will use one example from one fictional example and several real-world examples from actual counterterrorism operations. So let's start with the fictional one, because I think it can set the stage perfect for the arguments that I'm about to make. Now, I'm not sure how many of you watched the British thriller Eye in the Sky with Helen Mirren acting as one of the main characters. But in any case, I highly recommend it. It's now free on SBS, and I think it really shows some of the problems in the way that we conceptualize counterterrorism operations generally, and specifically with regard to the heavy reliance on digital technologies and particularly predictive technologies. So in a couple of images that I collected from the movie, and they're presented here in the slide, we can see that the way that the movie structures these decision-making processes. And the reason that I chose to focus on this movie in this introduction is because after the movie was released, was exposed to several op-eds, articles, conversation pieces by international scholars, international law experts, human rights experts, basically describing this movie as a must-watch for anyone who is interested in a realistic description of counterterrorism decision-making processes. And I had quite the opposite response when I was watching it. So to begin, the movie is about this highly sophisticated operation in Kenya, where it's a collaborative operation of US and European, mainly UK forces and decision makers, where they are set to stop some terrorists from bombing a crowded mall. And in the beginning, it starts with this Predator drone in the sky out to surveil the surrounding, to surveil those terrorists and to collect information about their plans. Now, while this is going on, we can see very clearly that the factual scenario, the factual framework for this ongoing operation is very clear. So based on those very sophisticated advanced technologies, we can look at, we can see the white in the eyes of those suspected terrorists. We have a 100% accuracy with regard to the match. So we know for certain that these are the people that on our wanted list. We can zoom into the room and see the exact details of all the weapons that that they plan to use, that they collect, and we can even see them putting those bombs under their clothing. We can also see what's happening in the Predator drone command and control. We can see all the data that is coming from various devices and that surveys the surrounding of the building where they're at. So we have this factual certainty really about what is going on and what our options are. And those options seem quite grim because we see those terrorists, we see all the weapons, we know what they're about to do, we know who they are. And now the real question that the movie poses to the viewers is, do we do it? The only reason for us not to is a collateral damage, the anticipated death of this one little girl that will be in the surrounding. Now we can't, even though we know for the way that the facts are presented, we know for certain everything else. What we don't know for certain is whether this little girl who is in the area will get killed. So the algorithm that is used here tells the decision makers, well, there is a 65% chance that the girl will be killed. And then we have this scenario where Helen Mirren is told that, or Helen Mirren's character is told that in that case, she needs a higher approval from the minister for that. And then she asked, well, but what happens if we change the calculation of the algorithm and we measure the impact of the bomb from this angle rather than that angle? Now, the IT guy immediately say, well, that reduces the risk from 65% to 45%. And the lawyer in the room immediately jumps up and say, no, we can't do that. And all of us as viewers are invited then to think that there is a problem in that suggestion, because the truth is that there is a 65% certainty that the little girl will be killed, while the 45% is the not truth or less truth. And the question really triggered my thinking, because both options are just as arbitrary in the way that they represent the reality. Both are presenting us a scenario based on some internal methodology that is not clearly visible to us, that we can't really evaluate, and therefore we are not in a position to even evaluate the levels of uncertainty that feed into all of those scenarios that are presented to us in this movie and to decision makers in real life. Now, in the next 20 minutes or so, I will use data that we have from real events and real war room decision-making processes to demonstrate some of those problems. And I think this really resembles some of the assumptions that we traditionally had in what is called the ticking time bomb scenario. Because in that scenario, we again believe that we know everything. We have the right person. We know that this person has the information that we need to know. And we know that if we torture that person, then they will give us this information. And based on this information, we can prevent a horrible event from happening. But, and then, you know, we have this ethical question in front of us, should we use torture or not? But just as in the ticking time bomb scenario, we never know that, you know, that the bomb is actually ticking. We never really know for certain that the person that we have is the right person, or that they know the information that we want to get from them. So in this scenario, we don't really know for sure that those are the people that we're looking for. We don't even know how they were inserted into or added to the kill list to begin with. We don't really know what will happen the next moment once we, you know, close the cameras. We don't know that they will go and continue with their plans. We don't know how many people will get killed. We don't know that there will be any other incident that perhaps will prevent that scenario, that terrible scenario from being fulfilled at the end. So there are lots of unknowns. And instead of looking at, do we kill the little girl, yes or no, question in order to save hundreds, I want to step a couple of steps back and questions all those assumptions that led us to this moral and ethical question at the end, which is the question that we always focus on without really shedding some more light on our factual infrastructure and the epistemological conventions that we used in order to present all those facts in a particular way. So just as a kind of a segue from Eye in the Sky, I wanted to say a few words about preventive counterterrorism more generally. Now, in the past, we counterterrorism and the way that we treated, or the main way that we used was to deal with some of those dangers were past focus measures, particularly criminal law measures that that entail very different fact-finding methodology, right? Because when we collect facts about things that already happened in the past, there is some evidence that can be used, and even though facts can always have different interpretations, evidence have different, you know, measures of credibility and reliability, we're looking to carve out what happened in the past. Now, in recent years, or perhaps following, not really recent anymore, so following 9/11, we have a move from those criminal or past-focused methods to more future-focused methods, which are administrative in nature. Some of them are armed conflict methodologies, and those are so. For example, we use preventive measures like asset freeze, like no flight lists, and even kill lists. So all those measures, unlike looking at trying to convict someone for crimes they committed in the past, all those measures are looking in the future. And so the facts that we're collecting for that preventive regimes are also different in nature, because there are things that there is no truth or absolute truth that we can find. We never know for certain what would have happened unless, you know, we did what we did, or unless we've taken a few steps. So it's always there is always additional challenges in preventive fact-finding regimes when we're trying to understand what will happen in the future. And so to answer those questions about what will happen and have a more robust preventive regime, we started to use various predictive technologies, and those include extraterritorial surveillance mechanisms, drone and satellite imaging, automated algorithms and big data analytics. And we use them in different ways and in different contexts as well. Now, the problem with all those, maybe before the problem, the advantage of these methods is really that they provide us with huge amount of data, and they allow us to know or to understand things that were not available before the development of those digital technologies. However, they also have several weaknesses that are not necessarily discussed well enough in the literature and in the public discourse. Now, one of the main issues that I would want to highlight today is that they rely on invisible epistemology, at least to decision makers, right? And opaque evidentiary standards. So it's not at all clear what amount of evidence and what is the reliability of that type of evidence that is used to put for the United Nations Security Council sanctions regime, for example. So individuals can have their assets frozen, and based on those, predictive technologies, evidence gathered from predictive technologies, and because we don't have clear visibility on the evidentiary standards used, it's very difficult to challenge the decisions that are made based on those technologies or their outputs. So let's move on to some of the examples from counterterrorism operations. And I want to highlight 6 different challenges that I identified by looking at reports and commissions of inquiries and investigatory bodies that were established following several operations conducted by both US and Israeli forces. Now, one of the weaknesses or challenges that arise from the use or the heavy reliance on digital technologies in counterterrorism decision making is that it reduces situational awareness. And that means that the image from a drone can capture the decision maker's attention at the expense of what is currently happening on the ground. And in a similar way, it numbs human judgment. So instead of exercising our human judgment, looking around at our at the field and exercising this on a daily basis, we're now used to trusting the technology rather than our own common sense. And one example that I can use for both of these problems is the event, the operation in Kunduz in Afghanistan in 2015, where US forces, together with Afghanistan forces, bombed a hospital in Kunduz, Afghanistan, killing 42 staff members and patients, and some family and relatives. And so in that event, ultimately, what happened was that some of the technology that normally would identify the hospital as a protected coordinate was not working properly. And because of this kind of trust or the habit that if you are, coming near to a protected, or if you are aiming at a protected destination, then some system is supposed to alert you to that. But because the alert system was down, then the crew, the Hellfire airplane crew, simply didn't realize that and were not following other procedures that they would have unless they had the technology to begin with. Also, the visuals that they received from their systems were similar to the description that they received from the ground. So instead of again relying on more traditional sources of information as they used to in the past, then the overwhelming impact of the visuals and the problem of not having all of the technological decision-making assistance systems in place, functioning properly, together probably influence that huge error in judgment. Now, another problem is that when decision makers receive outputs from digital technologies, they tend to treat those outputs as objectives, as reliable, and without real visibility of how they were produced and what are some of the weaknesses that this may entail. So, for example, as you can see, unlike the 100% certainty visuals from eye in the sky, normally, so visuals do not necessarily have to be grainy, right? But in any case, visuals require some human interpretation. They can also be interpreted by algorithms, but at the end, some human interpretation is being inputted, whether in the design of the algorithm itself or by human analysts that analyze some visuals, and that type of interpretation usually becomes part of the image itself when it's presented to decision makers. So this is presented as a visual of something, and because of the limitation of those visuals, which are limited in their scope, in the territory they cover, in the time that they cover, so it creates the illusion that this is an objective description of reality, and that reality is 100% similar to what we see in the visual. And at the end, this really creates this gap between the actual conditions on the ground and this virtual reality that is now created in the minds of the decision maker based on those outputs. Now we have several examples. So in all the reports that I've examined while doing this research, I found that many of them had that particular problem. And one example that I can give from the Israeli experience is that in one case, Israeli forces bombed a house in Gaza, and the house of the Al-Samuni family, suspecting that this was a place of gathering for Hamas forces. And the reason that the house was bombed is that a drone visual that was supplied in real time to decision makers showed 5 men standing in the entrance of the house holding RPG missiles. Immediately, the house was bombed, and as a result, 24 family members of the Al-Samuni family were killed. There were only civilians in that house. Now, what happened in reality was that 5 men were going outside of the house to collect some firewood so they can make bread to feed the huge amount of people that were gathered there, because it was a fighting zone all around. And they were gathered there by orders from another military unit. Now they were stepping outside and were standing in front of the house holding firewood. But the grainy drone image in this case was interpreted as men holding RPG missiles. Now, in another case that happened again by U.S. forces in Afghanistan, the forces were U.S. drone team was following what they believed to be Taliban fighters, and they were following them for quite some time. And the drone team again determined that those individuals that were seen in the visual are all Taliban fighters. Now, the reason they decided they were fighters was because this was nighttime in northern Afghanistan in a mountain trail and they were all walking in a single file, as normally would be done by organized armed groups. In the morning, again, it was so they were accordingly bombed, and the result was that above 90 civilians were killed that night. And the reason was that they were civilians. So normally civilians will indeed be seen from a drone visual as scattered around a larger territory. But because this was a mountain terrain, there was a very narrow path, a very narrow mountain path there, and they had no other choice but to walk through it in single file. And again, because the drone image was so overwhelming, then it really outshadowed other sources of information that could have suggested otherwise. What you can see here on the slide, by the way, the cars are from another. This is a real drone image from another incident that happened in Afghanistan, in which U.S. Drone team followed those three cars, determining that they were holding only Taliban forces and there were no civilians in those cars. Again, there were different hints in those visuals that the people in the car were Taliban fighters, the color of their clothes, and so forth. They couldn't see any women or children. But then again, that was the direction from which the shots were taken, and ultimately, it was after the fact, it was discovered that in fact these were civilians in those cars. So and again, and 31 civilians were killed in that operation. Now, in all those three operations that I just discussed, the problem was that the techniques used for analyzing those outputs, the visual outputs from the drone imagery, were not adequate to fully understand what is being depicted in those visuals. And one of the problems that I think needs to be urgently addressed is this human-machine interaction. So we have predictive technologies that provide us with outputs that can lead us to better conclusions with regard to the factual scenario, but we are not trained well enough to understand those or to accurately interpret those visuals and data points. And partly that is the case because the decision makers are usually not familiar with the way that the outputs are produced, with the way that the algorithms are designed, with the type of information that is fed into those technological methods of fact collection. Another problem is that these types of data collection methods enable demonization, because instead of looking outside a window, right, or just seeing the field from your own eyes, you see individuals, you see civilians as dots, sometimes as red dots, often, and sometimes described by algorithms in non-human terms. For example, an algorithm would have an output, for example, that there is I don't know, let's say 55% certainty that 1.8 people will be killed. Now, what does it mean, 1.8 people? So when we reduce humans to dots and to partial numbers, that is really not something that encourages decision makers to think about them as human beings. Makes the decision making more makes it more easy to take the decision to take the risk and harm that 1.8 individuals. And the last point that I wanted to to mention here in this context is the accountability gap, because one of the problems that we can see is that in situations where decision makers are relying on decision-making assisting technologies, so basically technologies that are used during the decision-making process, there is a human-machine interaction, as I mentioned before, that is not fully studied, and it's easier to blame the failures or the errors on the technology instead of trying to understand why or what was suboptimal in this human-machine interaction and how we need to improve that. Because if the technology created that error, then perhaps we can, tweak the algorithm, but it will not solve the ultimate problem of this unique interaction that is growing in the quantity and the scope that we use those technologies in our decision-making processes. Now, so what do we do next? How do we improve preventive counterterrorism, and how can we improve the decision-making? Now, in his 1904 autobiography, Mark Twain said that there are 3 types of lies in the world: lies, damn lies, and statistics. And I think that we should think about that when we look at the outputs of predictive technologies, especially in sensitive and life-threatening contexts such as counterterrorism, and especially preventive counterterrorism. Because while statistics are not really a lie in its own, just like predictive technologies, they can be misleading and they can be misinterpreted. And we have to do a better job in learning all those weaknesses and addressing those and training decision makers to be more familiar with those with the production and the epistemology of those decision-making tools. The main issue that we have to address here is that because of this future-focused orientation, uncertainty all of a sudden became the new certainty, because there isn't a past event that we try to understand, how it happened and why. There is a future event that is uncertain inherently, that we can never be certain that something will happen in the future. And so one thing that we need to give further attention to is how do we even think about certainty? How do we think about evidentiary standards? What are the evidentiary standards that we can apply to future scenarios? And a couple of suggestions in those lines are, first of all, enhance significantly the transparency about fact-finding methodologies and data quality, data breadth, data scope. We have to be more familiar, not in the IT departments, but the decision makers themselves have to be more familiar with those fact-finding methodologies, and there must be more transparency about how those facts were collected, what's included, and how the picture was painted. Now, in a similar way, we must have a better epistemological clarity about the evidentiary standards, as I mentioned before. So, because this is future-focused preventive measures that we're using, we have to develop those evidentiary standards that can be used and that we can be transparent with regard to. And finally, as I mentioned before, I think that the main area for us to research as scholars and for society to debate more broadly is how to improve human-machine interactions in sensitive decision-making contexts, especially in those counter-terrorism scenarios, whether those are being done by the UN Security Council in its sanctions regime or by various security agencies in their daily operations. I'm now happy to take any questions that you may have, and thank you for listening up to here.
Well, thank you very much, Shiri, for your your great presentation. It raised a lot of issues. We have a few questions, but I'd remind people that if you have a question, could you please put it into the chat function, and I'll work my way through the questions that we have. Maybe Shiri, if you stop sharing your screen, that would be, and then we can. Thank you very much. So the first question that we have, which is one from Chad, which is a question which really relates to the fact that the algorithms are constantly adapting and learning, so that even those who built them can't always know what conclusions that they're going to come to. So he asked the question about where does that leave us, and how do you analyze that that way in which the algorithms evolve?
Thank you, Chad, for this really important issue. So I haven't talked about machine learning technologies and AI, and those raise additional problems that I haven't mentioned, including so I mentioned the accountability gap, but that grows even more when we have algorithms that are learning and adapting, because then you can ask, well, is it really the human who made the decision, or is it now the algorithm acting their own? And this is indeed a challenge that many countries are now struggling with. But I think my answer ultimately is that if you design the learning algorithm, then you're responsible for the algorithm's development. And I think that's probably one reason that we would want to limit the use of those learning algorithms in some contexts, because we want to have a human that is ultimately responsible for that. For wrongly made decisions. And we also want to better understand how to prevent those errors in the future. And like we can't always trace why people made mistakes, I think with regard to algorithms, we can trace the flaw in the design. And in that regard, I think it ultimately becomes then quite similar to the other algorithms that are simply providing with outputs and then provide them for a human to make a decision.
Thank you very much for that answer. Eva, the next question from Lydia, which raises a number of different issues. The first point is whether there is any jurisdiction that actually has in place regulation or legislation addressing some of these challenges. And there are a couple that she mentions, in particular, limiting the use of predictive technologies for policing or military purposes. And the second one is around algorithmic transparency before agencies adopt some of these features.
Thanks, Lydia. That's another really important area, and I think that's growing, right? So because we have those technologies that are growing and they influence decision making in many other fields. So they influence immigration decisions, they influence police decisions, they influence social security, and so basically controlling not only counterterrorism but almost every aspect of our lives now. And so governments have so in New Zealand, for example, we have a new established agency for algorithmic data collection, and so that has been developing, but I haven't seen any country regulating its national security or counter-terrorism use of those technologies. And in particular, so this is based on a paper that I wrote that looks at the UN Security Council sanction regime, and also Israeli and US security forces. And in all those three contexts, there is no limit on the use of those predicting technologies. Now, I think one of the recommendations should definitely be, and I elaborate more on the paper, to go in that direction of limiting the type of predictions that we can rely on in a life or death decision making.
Thank you. The next question, which is from Michelle, raises a question which actually goes back to your first slide, really. It's about the way in which AI and these technologies are seen in popular culture, in which we often get endowed with superhuman or divine characteristics. But the popular culture doesn't really raise any of the moral or ethical issues involved. So how do we change what is often, I suppose, in popular culture, a very positive view of these technologies?
Yes, so I think that's why I started with this project to begin with, because I do think that this is a very accurate description. I think that these are often idolized and perceived in this way. And I think it's not only popular culture, but also decision makers who are influenced by this popular culture. And so we all, I mean, it's human, I think it's human to look at those visuals and be, very influenced by them, especially in time-pressured situations. So they affect the general public. They also affect decision maker in similar ways. And I think that, and that's why I opened with Eye in the Sky, because I've seen so many that commend this, including the legal advisor of the ACLU, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross. So organizations that normally are very critical of those types of technologies and events are, wrote praises for the movie Eye in the Sky, because of that kind of realistic depiction of decision making. And I thought that this was really a missed opportunity to look at some of the or to question some of those assumptions that are made so easily in the beginning, and set the stage that we know everything, we have the technology, and if the technology will just go, a few more steps forward, we will be able to predict the future with 100% accuracy. So I thought that this movie was really damaging from that perspective. And I don't really have the solution because I'm not a movie maker, but I would be very happy to see someone that would present some of those real events that I just described, where we can see, that this was the description, this was the 100% accuracy assessment, and here is how far it was from what was actually happened on the ground.
Thank you. I have a question which follows up a bit from that. One of the areas in which AI is seen often in a positive light, and one in which the general public is most familiar with it, is its use by social media in deciding more generally what to block and what not to block. And a few years ago, I remember Theresa May, when she was Prime Minister, was stood up and said, we have this technology, which is, I think she said it was 94% accuracy in blocking ISIS propaganda, and what a good thing this was. So I just wanted to see if some of the issues that relate to that use of AI.
So I think the reason that I wanted to focus on the technology in the counterterrorism context is the significant outcomes that errors have, right? So if you misread the drone visual and you bomb a house and you kill 30 civilians, then you cannot undo that decision. So I think that while it is a problem in other contexts as well, in some of the other contexts, there could be ramifications, there could be corrections, right? If you blocked some content and that was a mistake, you can unblock it once you have some fact-finding process. So I think those issues can be problematic, but they are not irreversible in the same way that some of those kind of more problematic counterterrorism measures are. Even if it does not necessarily have to be a life or death decision, but if you put someone on a no-flight list, or if you put someone on a asset freeze list, then it's almost, and that's part of the research that I've done for this paper with the Security Council decision making, for example. It's almost impossible to refute that because of the opaque nature of some of the evidence on which it is based. So you have decisions that it's almost impossible to undo them because you don't have any visibility. And now you don't have full visibility with some of those, social media processes blocking content, and that can be a real harm if you're blocked out of your account or if your content is blocked. So that's definitely an issue that deserves a social concern and some better ways to enhance visibility. But I think it's different in the sense that there are always other ways, and the harm is significantly different.
Linked to that, we have a question which asks about how we can respond, or how you might propose we respond to the pushback from national security experts that if you have too much transparency around these things, they might compromise operations and national security know-how.
So this is not a new. This is not something new, and I've one of the cases that I've looked at that was from a different project and not about technology, was basically a case where security agencies said, "Look, I mean, we made the mistakes because we collected information about the whereabouts of the suspected terrorists, but we didn't collect enough information ultimately on, the potential collateral damage." And the reason that they didn't collect enough information about potential collateral damage was, according to their own explanation, that if they kept, collecting more and more information about the surroundings, that would have tipped off the suspect, and they couldn't target them successfully. So we can see that, and obviously there could be some truth to that, but we have to, consider the balance here, and in that case, yes, transparency has some may have some problems with regard to the efficacy, but I think ultimately transparency is so I think the problem is in the way that this question is being framed, because if transparency leads us to better decisions, then this is good for security. Right? So this is really how we frame the question. So I think when security agencies have those kind of these types of arguments, they basically have this underlying assumption that they already know what is the right decision. And so they want to follow it without giving too much information about their planning. But if you don't accept this underlying assumption that this is the correct decision, and if this is not the correct decision because there is not enough transparency about the data and the veracity and accuracy and the way that it's updated, then ultimately lack of transparency would lead to suboptimal decisions, lead to errors, and then to the report that we have to read and then come up with a decision, well, we need more transparency. And then they will say, well, but more transparency can lead to other problems because terrorists will be more on alert. But ultimately, I think that argument is flawed because of this underlying assumption that is simply incorrect.
Thank you. We have a question, right, that we've been talking about the use in relation to use of the technology against terrorists, but it's obviously available to anybody, including authoritative regimes using it against their own people. So perhaps you can comment on some of the work that may have been gone into analyzing that.
I'm not sure. So analyzing the way that predictive technologies are used by oppressive regime, for example, like China using it to surveil human rights activists. Is that the context?
I think that context, and also more broadly that this actual technology and the can be used more broadly if people, authoritarian governments want to control by any means their own people.
Yeah. So I agree. I think that this is another problem, but this is kind of a broader claim that regards to the surveillance society in which we live in. And obviously, we are all being surveilled all the time by very different and a veracity of different organizations and institutions. And as you live under oppressive oppressive regimes, then the outcomes of that, the impact of the data that is collected through those means can influence lives in a meaningful way. So I don't have any particular insights with regard to what do we do, because those regimes that use surveillance in order to put in jail human rights activists or some or to persecute minorities, then they don't really care about the type of criticism that I raise here. But I think that this is a problem, and I think that we have perhaps the power to do something about this from the perspective of we are clients, and some of those, because those technologies are being sold for money by companies that operate in the global market. And I think one way that I think the world should progress, or one thing that we can do, is to have more transparency about who are those companies that are providing those harmful predictive technologies to oppressive regimes, and have some financial implications or sanctions implemented to those companies.
Just on that, which country do you think will take the lead in promoting these new international rules? Is there any country that you see as potentially a leader in this?
Yes, so I can say absolutely not US, definitely not Israel, not China. If there will be some progress, it could be some European or Scandinavian countries. It can be New Zealand, and perhaps even Australia. So I'm not very optimistic about Australia, because I think here too authorities like those technologies and the advantages that they can give us in some context. And I do understand and value that contribution. So I don't want to say predictive technologies are bad per se. No, we use them for a reason, because they provide a lot of information that can sometimes even save lives. But we have to do that in a more careful way. And I think we can already see some advances in the UK, in Sweden and Norway, Germany, and especially in Germany, they have a constitutional regime that develops around a right to self determination with regard to information. So informational self-determination. And so I think we can look at that development in Germany's constitutional law as something that perhaps can pave the way for more countries.
Thank you very much. We're getting to the last few minutes of our time. So if anyone has any additional questions of Shiri, if you could put them in the chat now, that would be good. But just a question, thinking about some of the issues that you were raising about, you might say, revealing the countries, revealing the countries that are the companies that are actually developing this technology, and highlighting them and making people more aware of them. Perhaps what is the regime that we put in place to, or the measures that we put in place to actually make it plain who's actually developing this technology?
So you mean what type of legal regime can be used to limit the operations of those companies?
It may be a legal regime, or it may just be ability to to name who's actually engaging in these things?
So I mean, from the social perspective, then of course, human rights organizations, civil society organizations can take the lead in exposing those organizations, those companies, and shedding more light on their activities. They're already out there, so there are several media reports on some of those companies, including NSO, Black Cube, and others. And for example, the involvement of NSO in the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi. So that's one company that already is was exposed to some extent, and there are plenty others as well out there that provide oppressive regimes sensitive information that is then used to human rights abuses. So from social perspective, I think this is a process that already begun. And from a legal perspective, this is probably a human rights regime, and I think this can be advanced in by the UN, the Human Rights Committee, for example, and there are other bodies that can also look at the way that those companies abuse human rights or contribute to that abuse. So there is a whole legal regime on businesses and human rights and social corporate social responsibility. So I think this is should be a growing part of what we look at under that kind of heading of corporate social responsibility.
Well, thank you very much indeed. So we've reached the end of our time. But I want to thank you very, very much for a fascinating talk and for the discussion that we've had. So you've raised a lot of thought-provoking issues, a lot of legal issues, a lot of ethical issues, and give us all something very much to think about. Thank you very much indeed for your time.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for being with us, Shiri, and thanks everybody for coming. And we look forward to seeing you at the next AVERT webinar.